we don't educate our kids about how to use these technologies in ways that are relevant, because most of the lawyers advising the institutions that would be doing that education are deeply anxious that such an education would expose the institution to enormous liability for copyright infringement, right? So you've got kids that use the technology in one way, and educators who are terrified to engage with them about that. You know, take a video, remix it, take some music, add it to a story that you want to tell, share it on YouTube. All of these things are activities which, of course, are presumptively illegal. Now, you would think a decade after all of this began, we would be in a position where, in fact, we'd gotten over this problem and we had moved on to figuring out how to educate our kids about how to use these technologies. But in fact, rather than moving on, we've been waging an ever more effective war against our kids to get them to stop using technologies in all the natural ways in which they want to use technologies, rather than directing policy towards ways to enable kids to use these technologies legally and enabling authors and creators to be paid in a proper way. Now, why do we do that? Well, of course, the reason why policy is stuck in the view of 10 years ago is largely because of the enormous influence that particular narrow interests have in the way Washington thinks about these IP concerns. And that, of course, was most of my work for the last decade. But it's that focus, that extraordinary ability to narrow the debates that comes from the fact that they are the only ones with tons of money in this field, that slows our ability to deal with this problem that I agree with you is central and crucial. And until we, I think, solve the one problem, we won't be able to begin to solve the second.
I think there's also a related kind of institutional artifact problem here, which picks up on what you were talking about earlier. And I see this as we talk about how do we proliferate opportunities for engagement, and we're just beginning on the executive branch side to try to create more of them. But we're dealing with interest groups on the other side who are so used to being in a mode of fundraising as what they do. Their form of activism and engagement is give me a check, is a sort of passive notion of engagement. And so the sort of institutional conduits that would afford this opportunity create the kind of civic literacy. The number of groups that are reaching out to young people and saying, make the videos, give us your Twitter streams, you know, sit down with us and let's create new opportunities for collective engagement. I think we're mired partly in an old notion, partly because it's how government has worked, and so civil liberties and civic groups have evolved in response to that, which has created a kind of stasis. And at the same time, also our theory at the same time is so focused on this concept of deliberation as a form of participation. You know, we can sort of have neighbors that get together and maybe talk to each other, and there's a reactive, kind of reactive view of what they can do in response to government, but the notion that we could actually articulate a problem and then people could use the new media tools that are available to them to engage in collective action, to solve problems for themselves, to get out in the streets in their own neighborhood. I mean, I love the carrot mob example from San Francisco of the folks who actually self-organized to support the local store that had the best environmental practices and then exercise the carrot rather than the stick of the boycott, the opposite, a reverse boycott, to send all of their purchases to that one store, which then in turn did environmental retrofits, et cetera, in the store. So those kinds of collective action opportunities that we could be taking advantage of, we're just so ill-equipped to deal with as a result of both things like IP law, but also kind of institutional just stodginess.
May I put a question to Larry in response to his pushback?
Please.
So as I've been talking about this, this book and the research we've done on kids, one of the things that we describe is their view of intellectual property law. And as you can imagine, you've written a lot about this in Remix as well. There's a lot of confusion on the part of young people. There's not so much confusion about downloading music. Most of the time they do it. They do it unlawfully and they know it's unlawful and they're sticking it to the man, right? So we sort of have that as one category. And the other category is around the law related to Remix. In 100+ interviews, no one ever mentioned fair use, Section 107, any number of specifics around whether or not they could actually do some of this stuff. I describe this kind of duality, and very often I get the pushback from people who, in fact, are themselves copyright holders. So if you go to the little bookstore up the way, I suspect most of the people in the room are authors of, a book or a sound recording or a movie or any number of other things who may make their livelihood from these royalties, who might, in fact, support your vision of reforming Congress and, in fact, the step before it, this step that says we, in fact, need to engage young people, and the step before that that says we ought to make it not unlawful possible for them in a learning environment at least to do it. So I get this every time, which is it possible to pay creators, to reward creators, while also upholding these kinds of values that you're describing, encouraging these values in young people? Are those things mutually incompatible?
They're not, obviously. They, for the last decade, your colleagues, my future colleague, or just yesterday I became a Harvard professor. So
very exciting.
Current colleagues, Terry Fisher has been writing for forever about models that would both enable what he calls, it's a little bit too academic, semiotic democracy, what we could just call a kind of remix culture, to flourish, while at the same time compensating artists for their original creativity. We've had enormous amounts of creative input by scholars and actually some practical activists who have tried to map how to make this happen. We've had almost no progress in the policy space to get people to think about this. Indeed, I was just reading on the flight here. I've been away with my family on vacation, so I come back and I start reading the news and think that I'm coming back to a different world. So here's one instance of it. ASCAP is now making a claim that every time a ringtone on your phone goes off in a public space, that's a public performance, and it's a violation of copyright unless somebody's...
I think we heard one earlier,
I did, I heard it, and I was reminded of this claim.
Where is the ASCAP police?
And of course, we've got more extremism in the IP holders. That's not actually being moderated in the context of the policymaking realm. So we've got to get to a place where we can begin to have this conversation, recognizing the system has got to compensate original creators. It's got to worry about what I think of as professional culture, make sure professional culture continues to flourish and survive. That's why I'm a strong believer in the need for copyright. I mean, there's a growing abolitionist movement. I'm an opponent to abolitionism. But because I think professional culture needs to be supported, copyright's essential to it. But amateur culture is also essential. And we should be celebrating the explosion of amateur culture, by which I mean not amateurish, I mean people who do it for the love of the creativity, not for the money. And that's exactly what internet technologies have enabled. But that's exactly what the law, in some weird sense, is trying to shut down. So, in America, we have things like universities kicking kids out of the university for copyright violations. That already feels extreme. But I was in Hong Kong a year ago, and I was talking about this story, and this guy got up and told me a story of his friend who was criminally prosecuted for posting a video with a soundtrack that he hadn't cleared the rights to underneath, remixing the soundtrack with these images, criminally prosecuted, because the Chinese government's view is that's the only way that they're going to continue to earn favor of the United States if they become as extreme as the United States rhetoric says they ought to be about IP enforcement. Now it's outrageous to think that we're prosecuting children anywhere in the world. Forget Burma. These are supposed to be our allies, prosecuting children for being creative and expressing their creativity in ways that doesn't begin to harm anybody. If you're an author out there and thinking there's an enormous amount of money you could make from the remix market, you need to wake up and recognize it's a different world. You're going to make money by people noticing and recognizing your work. And that comes from spreading and allowing people to talk about it in ways that celebrate it and criticize it. And we ought to be doing that, and we ought to find a way to get policy to do that. And my complaint is we are nowhere closer in policy circles. Even the Obama administration, which I love, obviously, I think the administration is fantastic, has not yet felt itself strong enough to broach this topic openly and strongly publicly. And I understand why. They've got other more important fish to fry, and to open this up would be disastrous for a whole bunch of reasons. But that's just to reinforce how backwards the system is, that 10 years after this war began, we've made no progress in policy circles about how to solve it.